From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I want to pick up on something Kim said earlier about chemicals to ensure clean drinking water. And this is a piece of President Biden's statement. I'll just read his assessment of the effects of a rail strike. He says a rail shutdown would devastate our economy. Without freight rail, many U.S. industries would shut down. My economic advisors report that as many as 765,000 Americans, many union workers themselves, could be put out of work in the first 2 weeks alone. Communities could lose access to chemicals necessary to ensure clean drinking water. Farms and ranches across the country could be unable to feed their livestock. And Monet, that gets me in mind of a question of why are these rail unions allowed to strike in such a way that it potentially holds the country sort of hostage, if you want to put it that way. I mean, if we're talking about communities, water treatment plants, not having the ability to get the chemicals they need to ensure clean drinking water, as the President of the United States says. That puts me in mind of Calvin Coolidge and his response to the Boston police strike in 1919. This famous line is, "There is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime." And I understand there's a distinction here. We're talking about private rail workers, not public police workers. But it does seem to me that there's a real problem here that a future Congress, maybe not Joe Biden, but a future Congress ought to be looking at if we're in a position where a rail strike could shut down clean water access for Americans across the country.
Yeah, I agree. I think anyone would say it's a huge problem that what should be a private negotiation between certain groups of workers and their employers could turn into a strike that would basically grind the entire US economy to a halt. And I think the important thing to remember is that this is a problem of Congress's own making, in that the Railway Labor Act mandates that there be an industry wide negotiation. So, for most industries, you have unions that represent a variety of different workforces on a company by company basis, and they every few years will sit down with the employers and hammer out a new bargaining agreement that affects that specific company. And you have some industries, like the auto industry, where the companies choose to voluntarily negotiate together. So, for example, the United Auto Workers branches of Ford, Chrysler, and GM tend to move in the same direction. But that's very different from having a law that mandates an agreement that covers an entire industry. So that basically means anytime the unions are reluctant in the railroad industry to strike a deal, they all stand the risk of striking at the same time in a way that means that a sort of freight rail all grinds to a halt. And so ideally, you do want workers to have the right to bargain collectively and potentially even to strike if they do feel that they have not received acceptable terms from their employers. But the fact that you have thousands and thousands of workers, this entire industry altogether striking, is what really elevates the risk.
But it does seem to me that there are some examples, and again, I suppose these are public workers, but Ronald Reagan staring down the air traffic control workers. In many states, teachers are not allowed to strike, or police officers, firefighters are not allowed to strike. And again, those are examples of public workers. But if there's a movement, a lot of other countries have privatized air traffic control systems. And I think there are arguments for that model, and we can take those up another day. But if we ended up there eventually with a system of private air traffic controllers, I have a hard time thinking, Kim, that the law would allow those people to go on strike for wages or days off and basically shut down any sort of air traffic in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. And there's always been a distinction in the minds of Congress and those who are writing these laws that there are certain categories of workers that simply have too much power to cripple the country and its economy if they don't go to work. And so we put them in different categories and different rules tend to apply. And as you mentioned, police officers, there's this question of air traffic, there's a question of railways. Ports are another one, and you've seen a number of presidents and White Houses tangle with longshoremen over the years on this issue as well, too. And I agree with you that we need to have a bigger discussion about these types of employments and how we settle these sort of disputes. It's still a bit of a mess, and it is such a mess in part because Congress is still operating under laws. In this case, the Railway Labor Act was done in the 1920s, a 100-year-old law. Nobody ever seems to have the appetite to kind of update some of these clunky old mechanisms that we have for things. And it's probably long overdue.
Meantime, voters in Georgia are going to the polls for the runoff next Tuesday between Raphael Warnock, senator, and Herschel Walker, his challenger. And notable, the headline at CBS News here is Georgia sets one-day early voting record in Senate runoff. And one thing to note is that the early voting period this year is shorter than it has been in the past. So you have to factor that into account. It's more people getting to the polls in a shorter time period, but still notable turnout there. And Monet, what's your sense of how this runoff is shaping up between these two candidates?
Yeah, so it seems as if Raphael Warnock still has the advantage. He did edge out Herschel Walker in the vote count in the general election, but neither candidate was able to secure the 50% that they needed to avert the runoff. But Warnock does still have a slight lead in the polls. There was an AARP poll that came out first after the general election that showed Warnock up by about 4%. And subsequent polls have showed a very, very tight margin. So it's still certainly in the air, depending on how the campaigns are able to turn out their supporters. But I think people tend to assume that Warnock has a slight edge. But on the question of early voting, I can say that I saw this firsthand. I was in Atlanta very recently on the Saturday after Thanksgiving, and I saw lines down the block at one polling place in Buckhead, which is sort of the upscale part of Atlanta in the north part of the city. And you could see that people really were very enthused. So I think people wondered, such a short turnaround after the general election, is there going to be fatigue? But there really does not seem to be. There are still wall-to-wall ads. The campaigns are very active, and it does seem as if a lot of people are choosing to vote early this time around too.
Well, let me pick out one thing that seems to be working in favor of each candidate here. And a plus to Walker is it seems, Kim, that President Trump has decided that his best value here is not in coming to Georgia. And so it seems like Herschel Walker will be able to rely on surrogates who are more popular in suburban areas, including Governor Brian Kemp. And here is Governor Kemp on CNN talking about why he's voting for Herschel Walker.
Does Herschel Walker share your values?
Well, listen, when I'm talking about going to Washington, D.C. and fighting for what Georgians need, I'm talking about the border, 40-year high inflation, astronomical gas prices since Joe Biden took office, and the agenda that Raphael Warnock has supported up there. I mean, to me, it's that simple in this race. And that's, why I'm voting for Herschel Walker. I want somebody to go up there and just go fight for our state and fight for our citizens, not fight to support a president that really, in my view, is not upholding the values of what Georgians want.
And you think Herschel Walker does that when it comes to values?
I think he will do that in the United States Senate.
Kim, we'll see, of course, if that can last, because President Trump still has a week to change his mind and to show up somewhere in Georgia. But it seems to me that if Herschel Walker can spend the next week saying, I'm a Brian Kemp Republican, I'm not a Donald Trump Republican, that may help him and maybe put him over the top.
Yeah, I mean, having Kemp out there for him is definitely the wisest move. Kemp outperformed Walker when everyone went to the ballot the last time around, and Walker's going to need those suburban voters to come around to him. This was one of the reasons Republicans lost those Georgia Senate runoff seats last time around, is because they rely very heavily on Trump getting out Republican voters that did not show up in the end in the numbers that they needed. And in the end, voters in a lot of those suburban areas flipped in the end for Democrats. So it's better for Herschel Walker that Donald Trump not come. There's still some talk about Donald Trump doing, for instance, what he did in the Virginia race where Glenn Youngkin won. And what he did there was did a big phone call to targeted Republican voters to try to gin up enthusiasm, but he never showed up in the state. It sounds as though this is what he might do this time. And that's going to help Walker. He's had some other surrogates coming in, people like Lindsey Graham, who do tend to excite people, but don't necessarily turn them off so much. So this seems like a pretty wise move, especially the polls do seem that this is still very tight.
On the other hand, Walker's weaknesses as a first-time candidate, I think, is the gift that keeps on giving for political journalists and for Senator Warnock. And here is the top of a CNN story in the last day or so. Republican Herschel Walker is getting a tax break intended only for a primary residence this year on his home in Dallas, Texas area, despite running for Senate in Georgia. It is a homestead tax exemption for the year 2022, approximately $1,500. And so, Monet, I mean, obviously, this is an oversight of some kind on Walker's part, and the point isn't the amount of money. But I wouldn't be surprised if Raphael Warnock spends the next week saying, Herschel Walker, I think that guy lives in Texas.
Well, I think you're absolutely right that the Warnock campaign is going to look for every single advantage that they can possibly seize. And these kinds of residency questions often pop up in these races, especially when you have first time political candidates. But I don't think that voters tend to take them too seriously. And I particularly think they'll discount them in this case because Herschel Walker is extremely Georgian. I think that anyone could say that. Obviously, he was running back for the University of Georgia. He was born in Augusta. He has lived most of his life there. He has managed businesses there, and he has a very, very strong accent. I just saw him speak at a rally, and it was incredible to see how he was able to work the crowd. So Herschel Walker is a favorite son of the state. Obviously, his life is controversial in a variety of ways, but I don't think that his Georgian bona fides can be called into question.
Thank you, Monet and Kim. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.